and faces, but we would like to welcome our new colleagues as well who are joining us for the first time. I am the Secretary of the UN Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples, and maybe while we are about to start, I'll probably just give you a bit of an overview of what is the UN Voluntary Fund, because it could be that some of you might be interested, and at the same time will have the opportunity in the future to actually use the fund, and precisely to use the skills and the information you have heard or you're about to hear in this webinar, not only for you, but also for your organization and your community. So very quickly, the UN Voluntary Fund for Indigenous People is one of the most important and one of the oldest mechanisms specific to Indigenous people. It's been there. It's been around since 1985. So it's over 30 years old. So it's not a young adult anymore. It's a full adult. And thanks to the fund, this fund has sustained the voice, the presence, the visibility of Indigenous peoples in the long history of Indigenous peoples in the UN system. And that historical development of Indigenous peoples' participation in the UN system. Those who are new, you will have the opportunity to learn and deepen your understanding about that later on, because those historical development of Indigenous peoples in the UN system is very important. In addition to that, just 3 points on the fund. So it's a voluntary contribution coming from member states mainly, but the fund also receives contribution from individuals, including foundations. It's also open for contribution from private company, but so far we haven't had any contribution from that sector. At the moment, it has a mandate to provide support to Indigenous people's participation at the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues that happens on an annual basis in New York for 2 weeks. It supports the participation of Indigenous peoples at the session of the UN Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is a week that happens in summer, normally in June or July in Geneva. And then it also provides support to the Human Rights Council session. So those who are new to the council, it has 3 sessions annually, 1 in March, 1 in June, and 1 in September. And the most important on Indigenous issues is the session in September, because this is the session where you have the special rapporteur on Indigenous peoples, the expert mechanism reporting their work and their activities to the council. So again, the fund provides support to Indigenous participation to the Human Rights Council. In addition to that, and this is also linked to the Human Rights Council, is the UPR, is the Universal Periodic Review mechanism. This is a mechanism that allows other member states to review the human rights record of their fellow states. So it's a peer review, and depending on who is being reviewed, it is a cycle, and that is why it's called periodic. The review happens every 4.5 years, and normally the review looks at the human rights record of that country, from civil and political rights all the way to economic, social, and cultural rights. So if your country is up for review, then you will have the opportunity to access the fund for to participate in the process. Now, in addition to that, then we have now additional mechanism that the fund also provides support Most recently, for example, we have now providing support to Indigenous people to participate in the annual session of the UN Forum on Business and Human Rights. So again, this forum happens in Geneva, and it's normally towards the end of November. So I'm telling you the dates, or not the dates, not the exact dates, but the months of this meeting. So then when you plan your participation or your advocacy strategy, so then you can also align this your application on those mechanisms. And of course, the subject of our discussion today is on climate change. And indeed, the fund is now providing support to the important processes of the UNFCCC on climate change twice a year. In fact, the support that we are now providing to climate change is the biggest bulk of support that the fund is providing to Indigenous peoples. This is the only mechanism that we get to provide support to Indigenous peoples represented twice a year. So one is the upcoming session of Substack. And then we always link this session with the meeting of the facilitated working group on local communities and Indigenous peoples platform that happens in June, and then followed up by the Conference of Paris, the COP meeting towards the end of the year. So you can access to the fund both in the June session and then during the November, or sometimes it goes all the way to December session of the UNFCCC. And then you have the whole treaty bodies. I will tell you a bit more on that later on once we have more time. So that's, on a nutshell, that's the UN Voluntary Fund for Indigenous people. In the Permanent Forum, we normally support about 15 Indigenous representatives. So meaning that is almost like 2 per region. And we, of course, provide, or we provide priority. We give priority to Indigenous women, especially Indigenous young women. Indigenous peoples who also belong to LGBTIQ communities, and also with Indigenous peoples with disabilities. And if there's 1 or 2 tips that I would like you to remember when you apply for the fund, I think the most important is that when you apply, make sure that you apply for the fund in advance. So we have a cycle of application, and it's quarterly. So meaning when the meeting for the Permanent Forum, which happens in April, so that is the 2nd quarter, normally the application is the 4th quarter or the 1st quarter. So you apply 3 months in advance, basically. So for example, all the meeting that is taking place in September, July, August, September, we are going to make the call for application soon. And all the meetings that we are providing support from April, May, and June, which is the 2nd quarter, we have already selected the grantees. So for example, those who are going to Bonn, for example, have been selected. And then I think what's most important is when you apply, you really have to show to the board of trustees, who's the one deciding who will have the grant or not. Of course, the secretariat will do the initial screening, but in the end, it's the board members who does recommend the grantees, is that you need to show a certain expertise on the meeting that you are attending. So for example, if you're interested to get funding for the UPR or for the treaty bodies or for the Human Rights Council, you have to show an evidence, a documented evidence that this processes, this mechanism, that if you're going to the treaty body session, that you have submitted the short report to that specific treaties, like for example, CEDO or CRC, or if it's in the UPR, that you have submitted a stakeholders report to the UPR, yeah? Or for example, if it's to the Human Rights Council, normally, the people that we select are those that have provided inputs to the call for inputs when the special rapporteur is developing or have developed a study on a specific thematic issue related to indigenous issues. Now, the one that we are a bit more open for newcomers, for example, those that haven't been exposed to the UN mechanisms or in the indigenous world in general, is the permanent forum and the expert mechanism, because this is where we have more or less a bigger community of indigenous people coming in. It's a space for networking, it's a forum, and we have a bit more of a leeway in the people that we select. For example, on climate change, we of course give preference to those who really follow the process and those that show expertise not only at the global level, but those who really bring that learning at the community level. So that's in a nutshell the UN Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples. I think we are set to go. Once again, I would like to welcome each one of you. Those who have just joined us, I would like you to also use the chat box if you have any question to any of our panelists. And if you have any additional inputs that you want to provide complement to what our panelist is saying or sharing, you are most welcome to do so. We have interpretation in French, Spanish, and Russian. So please make sure that you do access those tools. Once again, this is the third series of this online training that we are providing with the fund in collaboration with our partners. And this time we have with us partners from the Secretariat of the UNFCCC. So they will be one of the speakers later on. So we have Donna Lagdameo here. We have colleagues from the IITC, International Indian Treaty Council, represented by Andrea Carmen. She would introduce herself later on. We have colleague from Tero. I think we have Jennifer Corpus, who is the policy manager of the organization. She would be joining us as well later on. And then, of course, we have Lakpa Sherpa, who is the lead on climate change of AIPP, the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact Foundation. That is the biggest regional organization in Asia, based in Chiang Mai. I also would like to recognize the support that we've been receiving with our partner Cultural Survivor. Without them, we won't be able to organize this meeting. So very grateful with all of you. And then finally, with our colleague from IPRI, it's the International Indigenous Peoples' Rights Organization. It's based in the Philippines, but they've been very helpful with us, especially with our interpreters team. So once again, thank you very much from the outset. I would like to welcome and thank each one of you. And I think without further ado, I do recognize a colleague from the office, Ben Shuster. I think Ben is with us here. We have asked Ben to provide the introductory part of this session, which is the nexus of climate change and human rights, and more specific on Indigenous people's rights. And not only that, Ben has been working in the office for a while. And just to give you a bit of an introduction about him, he coordinates the Environment and Climate Change team of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. His work focuses on the advancement of human rights to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment through improved understanding of human rights impact of climate change and other forms of environmental degradation, corresponding to obligations and responsibilities of state. Prior to joining the office, Ben worked as an attorney in the US and as a research assistant with the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples at the University of Arizona. He studied in NYU at the University of Arizona, as well as the National University of Singapore. Ben, thank you very much for joining us, and yeah, please take away. The floor is yours.
Apologies, just a technical issue on my side. I hope you all hear me. Thank you very much for the introduction, Morris, and I'm excited to see so many friends joining us for this really important discussion. I will start with some sort of foundational remarks about human rights and climate change. I know that those remarks may be well understood by many of you, but I do want to kind of start by explaining how the office got engaged and working in this area, and what some of the key human rights obligations are with respect to climate change. I will touch upon the way that we've engaged in the work of the FWG LCIPP. I think that there are many of you on this call who are more qualified in many ways to speak particularly to that process and to the way that the rights of Indigenous peoples have been integrated in that process. So as I said, I will touch on that, and then I'll go into OHCHR's human rights advocacy priorities in the context of the climate negotiations, which I think have in the past and continue to be very well aligned with many of the advocacy priorities of the Indigenous peoples representatives with whom we work, and Indigenous peoples representative organizations with whom we work, and talk more about that sort of larger picture of the negotiations beyond the facilitative working group, local communities, and Indigenous peoples platform space, and then maybe also say a few words about things outside of the UNFCCC that are related to it. I'll try to do that very quickly. It's a lot to cover. I'm happy to answer questions immediately following that brief presentation. I'm very sorry that I'll have to leave this session at the hour because we're in the process of conducting interviews actually for growth in the environment and climate change team, which is badly needed so that we can better serve rights holders and serve our mandate. So we, OHCHR, and myself started our latest iteration of working on human rights and climate change because of a Human Rights Council resolution brought by a core group of Bangladesh, Philippines, and Vietnam in 2014. That resolution became an annual resolution, which I myself or team members have been charged with carrying out over the last roughly 10 years. It has given the office a solid foundation for engaging with the UNFCCC process. We started immediately after that first of the second iteration of Human Rights Council resolutions on climate change. So there were resolutions before that, but there was a gap and a change in the group of countries sponsoring the resolution before 2014. We started immediately engaging with the UNFCCC process. We participated in the Paris negotiations. I worked with Indigenous peoples representative organizations and other observers to the process to advocate for integration of human rights, and you know, the Paris Agreement preamble does include specific language on human rights, including the rights of Indigenous peoples, and states should respect, promote, and consider their respective obligations, human rights obligations, when taking climate action. So that's kind of the entry point, or the key hook. Over the next several years, following the Paris Agreement at COP21, the rules for implementation of the agreement were adopted, and there was a negotiating track as well to establish the facilitated working group for the local communities and Indigenous peoples platform. And OHCHR and myself engaged in and supported those negotiations, including intersessional workshops and other negotiations on issues related to, in particular, participation of Indigenous peoples, but of course, the broader set of issues and the broader context of the rights of Indigenous peoples in that process. Coming to the present, we've now done, I think, 8 or 9 Human Rights Council mandated studies related to human rights and climate change. So that's that large body of work I was referring to by OHCHR. We've looked at climate change and its impacts on the rights of people in vulnerable situations, climate change and its impacts on health, climate change in food, children, migrants, older persons, gender equality. That's OHCHR's work. The special procedures mechanisms of the Human Rights Council have also issued a large body of reports by all kinds of different mandate holders, right? Mandate holders are the independent experts appointed by the Human Rights Council to address specific issues. So there's one on water and sanitation. There's, of course, a special rapporteur on the rights of Indigenous peoples who has worked on climate change and environmental issues extensively. There's a special rapporteur on environment. And most recently, there was a new special rapporteur mandate established on the promotion and protection of human rights in the context of climate change. So again, there's this large corpus of work by special procedures mechanisms on human rights and climate change. Human rights treaty bodies have addressed this issue extensively as well. They've done so in the context of complaints procedures, some of which have been brought by Indigenous peoples. So there's a very well-known case, Torres Straits Islanders versus Australia, in the context of the Human Rights Committee's complaint procedure. There are a number of other complaints before different human rights treaty bodies, and there's a number of general recommendations and concluding observations addressing human rights and climate change. For example, the Committee for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women has a general recommendation on gender dimensions of disaster risk reduction in the context of climate change. The Committee on the Rights of the Child is in the process of drafting a general comment on children's rights in the environment with a focus on climate change. So a ton of work going on also by national human rights institutions. I could speak too long on this point, so I'll stop and I'll jump sort of forward to the present context. For those of you who will be attending SB 58 or are able to engage with and support colleagues or delegations attending the climate negotiations in Bonn and or the 28th Conference of the Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. There are a number of human rights issues that are very important. Morse, who supports the fund and with whom I've had the the privilege of working closely over the last couple of years, now that the Voluntary Fund is supporting Indigenous grantees to attend the climate negotiations, knows these issues well. I'm also very happy, actually, in Bonn or in other contexts, to follow up with people on an individual or bilateral basis on some of these issues. I will be in Bonn, and I will be at the Conference of the Parties, and Morse should be too, along with other colleagues. But I want to say, you know, the LCIPP Facilitative Working Group and its work plan are very powerful representation of efforts to integrate rights into the UNFCCC process. I am not, you know, I'm not the person with the most expertise on that issue. It's the people who are part of the Facilitative Working Group. It's the people who are regularly attending the Facilitative Working Group. We certainly, you know, do our best to support that process. And that meeting starts next week, and you've heard from others about it. So what I want to talk about is, first, to say human rights in the work plan, very present, particularly rights of Indigenous peoples, rights-based approaches. You know, there's a synthesis report to the technical dialogue of the global stocktake in the work plan that should be prepared, or perhaps it already has been. And so that's all there, very important. I think what I'm working on and encourage others to do is to bring that discussion to the greatest extent possible into the broader negotiations. And so in that respect, OHCHR has a number of advocacy priorities leading into COP28. These are, I won't share an exhaustive list. I'll share 5 things. And these are in no particular order. Overall ambition. We know from the work of the 6th assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that we are really running out of time to have any chance to keep climate change below 1.5 degrees Celsius. And we know from a variety of analyses done of the current nationally determined contributions, the commitments that states have made to mitigate and adapt to climate change, that those commitments, even if they were fully implemented, would not have us on track, or even close to on track, to keep climate change below 1.5 degrees. We also know from those reports that the human rights implications of every incremental increase in climate change are completely unacceptable. And I think one of the important communications points that we're constantly making and reiterating is, we're not talking about a threat. We're not talking about a risk. We're talking about an ongoing human rights crisis. And I think that's a point that many of you can make more powerfully than I can, speaking from lived experience, and really encourage you know, everybody to be part of that push for higher overall ambition. The second thing I want to talk about is directly related to the Facilitative Working Group, Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples platform, and a number of other areas: action for climate empowerment, the Gender Action Plan, and that is inclusiveness, participation, and making sure that there's, you know, a transparent, participatory, and safe process for engagement by all rights holders in the climate negotiations. We have definitely work to do, I think, to ensure that environment exists, that people have access and particularly the people most affected by climate change. And of course, that includes many Indigenous peoples, representatives and representative organizations. So a big part of our work where I think there's ample room for collaboration is with respect to the right to participation and civic space in the context of the climate negotiations. A third issue is the global stocktake. I mentioned already that the work plan of the FWG LCIPP has some specific content related to human rights and the global stocktake. This stocktake is the ambition mechanism for the Paris Agreement, right? This is the first one. What is supposed to happen is it will present a picture of efforts to achieve the objectives of the Paris Agreement, a global snapshot at this kind of moment in time to help states and other actors identify where we're following, where they are falling short in order to then ratchet up ambition. And that will involve, or should involve, revision and renewal of nationally determined contributions. It should involve a realignment with the best scientific evidence. So I referenced earlier the most recent IPCC report, and in alignment with the principles of equity and evidence-based decision making. So when that is concluded, it's ongoing, and there still are opportunities to contribute to it. It's going to conclude at COP28. Then states need to take action on the basis of the stocktake. So I think there's work to be done in terms of ensuring the stocktake reflects the lived experiences and the rights and needs of the people most affected by climate change. And then there's a lot of political work to be done to make sure that those findings are acted upon. Next thing I want to talk about is Article 6. Article 6 establishes a variety of ways for international cooperation to facilitate the objectives of the Paris Agreement. Article 6.4 in particular deals with carbon markets. And here there is an ongoing process led by the supervisory body, a constituted body under the UNFCCC, to articulate rules related to carbon markets and offsets, as well as define the types of credits or removals that can be part of carbon markets. This one has a very high level of risk, particularly for Indigenous peoples. It's the sort of successor to the clean development mechanism in many ways. And there are risks related to marketing carbon offsets, including potential risks of widespread displacement of people in order to pursue this sort of economic objective. There are also real risks associated with relying on removals when the technology and verification and validation mechanisms for assuring that those removals are real is definitively not in place, right? I mean, there's a ton of research out there about how removals or offsets currently being sold on the market don't represent actual removals or offsets. So that poses a huge risk in terms of our mitigation objectives and in terms of protecting people's rights by actually having reductions of carbon emissions. And I think it's really important, again, going back to that first point about overall ambition, the focus needs to be on actual reductions of carbon emissions, not on different solutions that may or may not work. And then the final point I wanted to address is loss and damage. There's an ongoing discussion. There are several work streams or agenda items under the UNFCCC on loss and damage. The one I'm going to talk about right now is efforts to establish and operationalize a loss and damage fund. That fund was agreed to at the last conference of the parties, so at COP27 last year, but essentially none of the details were agreed to, right? So it's not clear who's going to finance the fund, how much they're going to finance it, and who's going to have access to it. And of course, those are all human rights issues that will be critical to address to ensure that the people most affected by climate change actually have access to effective remedy and access to justice. I feel I probably already talked too long, but I do want to just say one or two more words on the kind of picture or space outside of the UNFCCC. First thing, litigation. There is a lot of ongoing litigation in order to pursue accountability in ways that aren't really possible within the climate framework, right? So I'll stop there on that point. Otherwise, I'd probably talk way too long. Linkages with the work of the Convention on Biological Diversity. There are a couple things I want to say about that. One is that the Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which was adopted at the end of last year, does clearly make the links to the UNFCCC process. It also clearly calls for respect for the rights of Indigenous peoples, including their rights to their lands, resources, and territories, rights to traditional knowledge, so on and so forth. We can't view these processes as separate processes. They're deeply interlinked, and we need a holistic approach with human rights and the rights of Indigenous peoples cross-cutting throughout. The third is the right to a healthy environment itself. There was a very long and arduous campaign by a number of stakeholders and rights holders, including Indigenous peoples, over the last decades to achieve universal recognition of the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And the UN General Assembly recognized this right in a resolution in July of last year. The UNFCCC, Conference of the Parties, integrated the right to a healthy environment in its cover decision last year as well. And so there's important work we can do under that framework. And finally, national laws and policies. I will not talk about them per se. I just want to say, do not neglect the impact that can be made, at national and local levels, because the UNFCCC process is just one part, albeit an incredibly important part of the effort to advance rights-based climate action. So I can answer a couple of questions now, if there are any, and I really thank you for your time.
No, Ben, thank you very much for joining us and for giving us a very important overview, and also linking the work that the human rights mechanisms are doing in Geneva with the processes that's taking place, whether this is born or in other parts of the world, and climate change processes. And what I have taken note from your sharing is the important aspect for Indigenous people to look at some of the most important decisions on Article 6, issues related to loss and damage, access to funding, this mechanism of litigation that is becoming now a practice. And of course, this universal approach of looking at human rights, environment, and human rights, and to ensuring that whatever is taking place at the international level we have to make sure that we bring them down at the national level. I think we have started very well in this context, and I'm really happy that you have taken that part. If we have any colleague that have burning question to them, please, I'll give you 5 minutes to raise those questions. Is there anybody who would like to take to ask a question? If there's none at this point, maybe Ben, just very quickly, when it comes to the issue of litigation, what has been the biggest challenge for Indigenous peoples to use this as a tool so far in your, in your observation, in your research? I mean, litigation is in any way, I think it's very important. Otherwise, then, the way we look at human rights is not really how can you enforce them. And I think this is one of the ways that we can show that, that there is an important aspect of the work that we're doing at the international level when we're able to pin it down, to specific human rights violation. So if you could give us some, some of the challenges normally of civil society organization or communities in using the mechanism of litigation, so that then those who are inspired to use this mechanism, that they can actually, it's a preemptive strike for them.
Thanks, Morris. I think there's somebody named David that wanted to ask a question.
David, yes, please go ahead. David Otieno. Do you want to unmute yourself or?
Taking a look at encryption.
Sorry, Morse. I think they cannot pose their question in person. So if they can do it on the chat.
Yeah, you can. Yeah, colleagues, if you have questions, please do so. Put them in the chat, and then we will take into account the questions. We will read for them for you.
Okay. I see a number of questions already in the Q&A as well.
Yes.
Morris, I'm happy to start with your question, which I'm afraid I don't have a great answer to in this specific context of Indigenous peoples engaging in litigation, just because that isn't an issue we have specifically addressed, and it probably should be. So thank you for the question. But the challenges, the typical challenges related to rights-based climate litigation are numerous. One is simply, having the information and resources needed to pursue a case. Another is that litigation often takes a very long time, and outcomes, even if they are successful, may not be implemented. And I think that that's unfortunately a very common problem with respect to various types of litigation in which Indigenous peoples have been involved. And I'm thinking particularly in terms of land rights recognition. When I say this, I think in spite of those challenges, the benefits are very clear, in the sense that litigation, even if it's not successful, has already impacted the policies and behaviors of governments and other actors that are parties to this litigation. So it's not just about winning and losing. Of course, winning and losing, a case is very important, but it's also about the narrative and the communications and the ways that being engaged in litigation can change behavior. And so it's a tool, both for legal accountability, but also for driving behavioral change. So I think that it's important to think of it in multiple ways, because Yeah, I mean, the resource challenges are significant. Another issue often is sort of it's the understanding of judicial systems, having standing, having the right expertise within a judicial system and within a community or within the sort of corpus of the person or persons themselves bringing a claim. So it's a challenging area, but it's also one where we've seen success, and it's one where there's a more potential accountability, right? And one thing I'd flag, which I think is quite an inspiring example, right? This won't be a legally binding outcome, but the GA General Assembly resolution requesting an advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice on the legal obligations of states with respect to people in vulnerable situation and countries in vulnerable situations because of climate change. Was adopted earlier this year. It's the first request for an ICJ advisory opinion ever to be adopted by consensus. And that opinion has the potential to be taken up by different courts. It's not legally binding, but it has the potential to really influence behavior. And there is an opportunity to sort of engage in that process for different stakeholders by providing inputs. That was a very probably too long answer. I am looking through the questions here in the chat. So I'm not sure that I can or should try to answer all of these, and hopefully there will be time for others to discuss them as well. But in terms of, well, here's an easy one. I'll answer that. COP28 is 30 November to 12 December, and it takes place in Dubai in the United Arab Emirates. The issue of observer credentials to the COP is one that our office is very concerned with. And there's a broad set of access issues. It's not just credentialing, it's cost, it's location, it's potential concerns about safety and security when traveling to and from and at destination. So there's a broad set of access issues that we are seeking to address. And one of the ways that we're working to promote and advance Indigenous peoples' participation is precisely through the voluntary fund that Morse introduced and does all the hard work to make happen. And that fund permits both attendance and credentialing, right? And so that's one way for those who are lucky enough to be selected and recipients of that support to engage. And the last thing I'll do, and I'll stop talking, is share my contact information. I shared some information materials in the chat here. I saw a request to reach out to me. I will do my absolute best to respond to messages or have somebody from our very small team respond to messages. I really will. We get a lot. If you don't hear from me, please just write me again. It's not a lack of commitment or interest. It's that we just have sometimes a total overload of messages. So there's my email. I will be in Bonn. I'm really happy to and always meet with Morse and Indigenous Peoples representatives in Bonn. I usually join 1 or 2 meetings with permission of the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change. I usually join 1 or 2 meetings there to introduce myself. So looking forward to continuing our discussion.
Thank you, Ben, for joining us. Colleagues, those of you who have raised questions on the chat, I could see that some of those questions are already a preemptive question to our next speakers. So for our next speakers, I would encourage you to look at the chat box. I think there are some questions that are actually more specific to some of you. Now, those who have been in the COP meetings, our next speaker is a veteran in this field, not only in COP but also in the Indigenous Peoples' rights movement. I am honored to introduce our next speaker, and she is Andrea Carmen. She will be speaking on the historical development of the Indigenous Peoples' participation in climate change processes, including the UNFCCC standards and mechanisms and climate change, and those that are specific to Indigenous peoples. Now, Carmen is from the Yaqui Nation in the United States. She became a staff member of the International Indian Treaty Council in 1983, and it's now the executive director since 1992. Andrea's work on Indigenous peoples started with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples since its negotiation in 1997, and has participated in the UN Earth Summit +5. So he has addressed the UN General Assembly. In 2006, Andrea was selected as a rapporteur for the UN Expert Seminar on Indigenous Peoples' permanent sovereignty over natural resources and their relationship to the land. The first Indigenous woman to serve as a rapporteur for the expert seminar. She was also an expert presenter at many UN bodies and seminars addressing a wide range of issues. And most recently, in February 2019, she was selected to represent North America's Indigenous peoples on the new facilitative working group for the development of the UNFCCC local communities and Indigenous peoples platform for its first 3 years of operation. And in 2021, she served as a co-chair. She is currently a member of the IUCN Climate Crisis Commission. Without further ado, Carmen, this is your floor now. Thank you so much for joining us once again.
And Chokweotesia, Umawayaim, respectful greetings to you, and thank you, my relatives from around the world. Thank you to our co-organizers. It's very important, I think, that those of us that have some experience are able to share that, especially with new representatives coming to the table. And this, of all of the bodies that we participate in internationally through International Indian Treaty Council and our work in collaboration with Indigenous peoples from around the world, maybe is the most crucial. And I was glad that Ben mentioned that this is a crisis. It's a humanitarian crisis for Indigenous peoples. Even beyond that, it's a survival crisis. And I think we need to recognize that. And that's why, despite the long trajectory of work that it takes internationally at the UN and the resistance that we have from the states, it's very important. In fact, it's critical that we participate on this level. This is a picture of just one of the ways that Indigenous peoples participate in the climate crisis. We have, of course, the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change. We usually call it the caucus, that has been in existence since the beginning of our work in this arena, but was more formalized around 2009, 2010. And this is a side event at the Indigenous Peoples Pavilion at COP27 that happened in Egypt last November. This is one that we sponsored, and there are many that Indigenous peoples sponsor. This one focuses on the impacts of climate change on Arctic Indigenous peoples food systems, specifically focusing on caribou and reindeer. And you can see participants speaking from Canada, Alaska, Norway, and Sami territory, and Russia as well. Just to give a context, all of our work at the United Nations is based on the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that was adopted in 2007. This is a picture of the adoption at the General Assembly, where I had the privilege to be in the room and see those green yes votes go up. We know there were 4 against, but those countries have now reversed their positions. So no country in the world actually opposes the UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And even though it doesn't specifically mention climate change, there are many rights in the UN Declaration, which of course is the minimum standard. It is not the ceiling, but that means it's the floor. We do not go beyond this, whether we're negotiating with our home country, the local school board or municipality, or any of the bodies at the United Nations, which are called upon to implement the UN Declaration, including the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. Many of the rights in the UN Declaration are the very rights that are threatened by climate change, but there are also through their implementation, the ways that Indigenous peoples are adapting and responding to climate change on the ground in our home territories, including Article 20, which is the right to our traditional economies and subsistence, means of subsistence. I'm not going to read the text. I know you all have your bedside or purse-sized copies of the UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples to refer to. This one, Article 26, was the hardest fought language in the whole UN Declaration, because it talks about our rights to our lands, territories, and resources, which we have traditionally owned, occupied, or otherwise used or acquired, not based on what's recognized by the states, or in the United States, for example, reservations. And we know in many countries, our traditional land and resource rights and our land tenure and demarcation of our boundaries are not even recognized, but the right is affirmed. Our spiritual right, Article 25, on our relationship with our lands and waters, and our responsibilities to future generations in this regard. And this really brings the issues we're addressing in climate change home to all of us. What is the life going to be like on our lands for our children, grandchildren, and their children? Will they be able to survive? Article 32, free, prior, informed consent and development. And this is the Standing Rock land defenders opposing the pipeline. Around the world, Indigenous peoples are standing in opposition to the fossil fuel development that is actually the primary cause of climate change. Our role is indisputable, and our right is affirmed in the UN Declaration. Before even we were able to achieve what Ben referred to at the Human Rights Council and then the General Assembly, we had the article in the UN Declaration affirming our right to the conservation and protection of the environment. Of course, this is a right that is core at the defense of our rights regarding climate change. And very important, a real challenge that has continued to this day at the UNFCCC and throughout the UN system is our right to participate in decision-making, which would affect our right. This picture is our traditional government authorities of our Yaqui Nation in Mexico. We are cut in half by the border between US and Mexico. Our nation is in the Sonora Desert. Now, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, and you have to get used to all these acronyms at the UN and long names of everything. was put in place and ratified at the first Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro back in 1992, that Indigenous peoples also participated in. Other conventions like the Convention on Biological Diversity and a range of others were also born at the first Earth Summit. And I want to make the point that there were 9 major groups that were affirmed as essential to participate in issues around environment and sustainable development, and Indigenous peoples, standalone peoples with an S, even though it was back before the adoption of the UN Declaration, was one of the 9. And these 9 have maintained their role at the UNFCCC process. Please note, we're not combined with anything, not local communities, vulnerable groups, or anything. Indigenous peoples is a standalone major group at the UNFCCC all the way back, going to 1992. But one of our problems there is that the rights in the UN Declaration, especially the right to participate in decision-making, has been a real challenge. These are 2 demonstrations by Indigenous peoples back in COP15 and 16 and 2009 and 2010, where we're calling and demanding for our rights to be respected as some of the major vulnerable peoples to climate change. To this day, it's been recognized that Indigenous peoples' ways of life are the first that are on the line here and threatened in this crisis, but yet we did not have a voice whatsoever. And even at COP21, famous COP21 in Paris, we were not allowed in the rooms where the negotiation was happening. This is just one of the demonstrations we had outside the halls, and the sign says, "We are peoples." Despite these challenges, as Benjamin mentioned, we were able to achieve the inclusion of Indigenous peoples' rights and human rights in general in the preamble. That's preambular paragraph 11 in the Paris Agreement. Very important. And of course, by that time, we had the adoption of the UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So when we refer to the rights of Indigenous peoples, that is the standard we're referring to. It also recognized Indigenous peoples' traditional knowledge and established a new exchange platform in operative paragraph 135. Recognize the need to strengthen knowledge, technologies, practices, and efforts of local communities and Indigenous peoples. And this was how the Indigenous Peoples platform was born. I want to stress, we were not, as I stated before, in the room. We were actually not calling for the establishment of a platform. We are calling for the recognition of the important and vital role of our knowledge and practices and sciences as Indigenous peoples. So when they adopted the call for a new platform, it took us about 4 years of meeting and consultations with states to decide, and also talking to our traditional leaders, our practitioners, knowledge holders, spiritual leaders. Do we even want to do this? What are the risks of discussing our, what they call traditional knowledge, our sciences, our time-tested practices with people that we know appropriate this knowledge for their own purposes? But after all, we decided that, you know, we needed to do this, and we affirmed Article 31, the right to maintain, control, protect, and develop our cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, traditional sciences as the basis for what's now called the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform. Again, we did not agree to the language local communities to be included in there. We would not have agreed with that, but that's what it's called. One of the things that we're working on is separating a local communities platform so that we can give them the respect to develop their own demands here and ways of working. But nevertheless, this is the picture of the adoption of the facilitative working group at COP24 in 2018. And one of the reasons that we really supported this, despite, some of the issues I mentioned, is it's the first body in the UN system where Indigenous peoples actually select our own representatives. It's made up of 7 representatives selected by the regions of Indigenous peoples and 7 state representatives. As we mentioned, the next session is going to happen next week in Bonn before the Substa. And it also is very important that it respects in the wording adopted by the COP, by the countries in its entirety, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Very important. This is a picture of the way that we primarily work as a unified political force in the Conference of the Parties, which of course is what COP stands for. The parties are the countries, but we've become very good at working in these bodies. This is the picture of the caucus in Sharm el-Sheikh. And it's important that we get a statement as the caucus, the IIPFCC, in the opening and closing session of the COP. And we said there that we reject carbon markets and offsets, geoengineering, net zero framework, this concept called nature-based solutions, ecosystem services, because they do not cut emissions. And in fact, the caucus says there are new forms of colonization, and we commit to real solutions based on reducing the emissions that we're all suffering from. As Ben mentioned, one of the focus areas that we've been working on is the Paris Rule Book, which implements the Paris Agreement, Article 6 regarding market mechanisms. This is a demonstration by our youth opposing what we call false solutions based on climate change and market mechanisms. But we were able to achieve at COP26 the inclusion of Indigenous peoples' rights in the Paris Rule Book, and also the establishment of a grievance mechanism for Indigenous peoples whose rights have been violated due to these market mechanisms. So we continue to work on this. We are working for full participation in the new grievance mechanism. As well as, and I don't want to get too much in the weeds on this. This is technical, but it also affects our day-to-day life because Article 6.4 establishes and codifies this market mechanism many times that pushes Indigenous peoples off their land. This is an example of a pine tree plantation promoted by IKEA, in fact, that uses pine for its furniture. And it's very important that a supervisory body was established and that the rights of Indigenous peoples based on preambular paragraph 11 was recognized as the foundation for this mechanism. And we're going to be working on that again. The 5th meeting of the supervisory body will take place in Bonn. And we can't say anything, but we can listen and we can certainly lobby the states to ensure Indigenous peoples' rights are upheld in this process. I just want to highlight a couple of other important advances we've been able to achieve through the work of the facilitative working group. And I just, full disclosure, I was the representative selected by North America, as Morris mentioned, for the first 3 years, and I served as the body's co-chair for its 2nd year. But a very important advance now in this new 2nd year, 3-year work plan was the official inclusion of Indigenous youth in COP27. And this is a report back to the states from the point of view of Indigenous youth and what their recommendations are, represented from North America and from Indigenous youth in Russia, shown here. We've also, for the last 2 COPs, and it's going to happen again at the upcoming COP28, been able to include Indigenous knowledge holders from our regions. And these are Indigenous peoples working on the ground. And I know that was a question. How can grassroots Indigenous peoples, how can our knowledge holders and practitioners and food producers, youth and women, our elders and spiritual leaders have input And this is one of the ways we've really been able to achieve that at the COP, is bringing knowledge holders officially from all of the regions, and they share their recommendations with the states. Just to conclude, or I'm getting close to my time here, but this was a statement from COP26, and I got to be one of the co-leads as a FWG member, along with Pasang Sherpa from Asia and Yao Mulalap from the state of Micronesia, in this first meeting of the knowledge holders. And they did address the issue of loss and damage, which I think is directly relevant to what we're working on here. They talked about the different forms of loss and damage of our water, our land, our food systems, our animals. But they also recognize that the loss and damage we have suffered from the impacts of climate change is already extreme and is both economic and non-economic, and directly affects knowledge systems and ways of life. While no price can be put upon what we've already lost and all that is threatened, adequate direct financial resources would greatly assist Indigenous communities to adapt to these losses, restore what we can, and protect and strengthen the resiliency of what remains. And just to highlight, you know, the fact that a lot of the loss and damage we're looking at is not able to be compensated. You know, these are core species that not only are essential for our nutrition and local economies, but our culture. These are the example of California salmon are not predicted to survive past the end of the century. This is my land right now where I'm sitting in the Sonora Desert. 2020 was the hottest, driest year ever recorded here in the Sonora Desert, where my Yaqui Nation lives. This is a natural indigenous plant, nopal, that we depend on for food and traditional medicine, and it was withering and wilting in its natural desert habitat. And this is just another example that is essential to our food system. This picture is from my land here. This is a Sonora desert toad that eats the insects around harvest time of our desert crops. And it is going extinct because of climate change. And no amount of money can bring this essential animal back. So, as was mentioned, a fund was, at least the concept of a fund, an agreement was for a fund on loss and damage was established at COP27. It is very unclear how or if Indigenous peoples will be able to be direct recipients. And we are also quite insistent that Indigenous peoples from all of the regions, not just what's considered developing countries, must be able to access these funds, the Arctic, for example. We also were able to get under the Santiago Network, which is another body associated with loss and damage for technical expertise. This was a huge victory last year at COP27, that Indigenous peoples will have a seat in this official UN body addressing loss and damage, along with women and youth. Question, are they really listening to us? This is us meeting with the representative on climate change, Ambassador John Kerry from the United States, and Deb Howland, Secretary of Interior. That's the big question. As Benjamin mentioned, one of the core goals of the Paris Agreement was to keep climate change temperature increase to 1.5 degrees centigrade. And already, even back in 2021, the scientific body that works with climate change predicted we were coming very close to that level already. And they've acknowledged that Indigenous peoples' ways of life cannot survive if we go much above that. And the temperature change is 3 times greater or more in the Arctic already. So what are they doing? Are they going to do anything is the question. And when I sat last year at the SBSTA, the secretariat working on this global stocktake came and reported on all these achievements of these different bodies, but they didn't talk about, are we keeping the temperature rise down? Are we really phasing out fossil fuel development? And they changed the language at COP27. It was reiterated at, COP26. reiterated in COP27, they wouldn't even say they were going to phase out coal production, which is probably the most emission high form of fossil fuel development. They changed it to phasing down. And the caucus commented on COP27's failure to produce significant progress on commitments by states to phase out fossil fuels. So are we talking, when we talk about loss and damage, about compensating with money for things that can't be compensated for? Or shouldn't we really be talking about preventing loss and damage? That's the position of the Indigenous Caucus. And as a result of that, I just want to stress, and I never leave talking to Indigenous peoples about the need to, independent of what the UN does, what the states do, to bring back your traditional foods. Here we're trading drought-resistant seeds in the Americas between Guatemala, Mexico, and the United States. Bringing back these seeds, that this is a long root of a Hopi traditional drought-resistant corn seed, and we planted it on our land here in the desert last year, and you can see it's growing beautifully. We always traded seeds with each other as Indigenous peoples. We need to do that again. In North America, they're bringing back the buffalo that can withstand many different climates. They're indigenous to this land. They can withstand drought and blizzards. These are cattle that died in a freak snowstorm, and no buffalo died at all. And also they don't pull up the grass like cows do. Cows came from Europe. They're not indigenous, but buffaloes clip the grass and hold the soil moisture. And about 70 different tribal nations in the United States are restoring the buffalo that were destroyed in the process of colonization. This is just down the road from us. The Tohono Nation are using the clay in the desert to bring back their traditional irrigation and water saving methods. This is Hawaii, where they've removed the invasive species, the eucalyptus, that were brought in from Australia. And as a result, now their water table is coming back up and they're planting taro. These are just some examples. I'm sure you have some too. Please focus on that on the grassroots level, because we don't know if they're going to really respond to our demands on the global level, even though we know we have to try. This is a side event we have coming up at the COP with the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage. We realize we have not had adequate time to express from Indigenous peoples how we see this issue. So we're going to be having that on the Wednesday of the first week of the SBSTA coming up. To share our perspectives on loss and damage and how we must be at the table with these dialogues, not just for the new fund, but also to talk about preventing loss and damage so that they can understand not only that our rights are threatened, but that Indigenous peoples have real contributions to make to this dialogue if our planet is going to be saved and our future generations can survive. Chokwe Otesia, thank you very much.
Gracias, Carmen. Thank you very much.
Andrea.
Always. Yes, indeed, Andrea. Thank you so much. Indeed, we're grateful for your sharing. And there's a lot of comments while you were talking. If you have had the opportunity to browse the chat group, there's a lot of comments on and how people appreciated your presentation. I think they were saying that they really liked your historical, providing the historical development of Indigenous people's participation in the climate change processes. But indeed, it's really good that you anchored your presentation and the participation of Indigenous peoples in these processes based on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and also highlighting that at the core of the declaration is the provision on prior informed consent. I think that's very important that you mentioned. But then on the other hand, it's also good to know that that when we talk about the declaration, that it's not the ceiling, because it's been a negotiated instrument, but really is the floor. That anything that goes beyond the floor is already a violation of human rights. I really like the way you put, this concept of a fund and the lost end fund, damage, you keep concept instead of saying there's a fund, because indeed, I think one of the biggest challenges the indigenous peoples have been saying is that where's this fund? People are talking about billions of money, but if I've heard that there's some studies already conducted and how this money is supposed to be, being put to indigenous peoples' communities and organizations, but it's really, really very minimal. They even saying that it's not even 3%. And but as you mentioned, we do have some victories. The fact that the indigenous peoples will have a voice, will have a presence on the Santiago network. But again, you raise a very good question: are they really listening to indigenous peoples? And then I like the fact that that you put this parallelism. Are they phasing down or are they just phasing out? Really good questions, very thought-provoking. But before I will ask colleagues to raise any question, maybe I just want to read some of the comments and maybe some of the question that is put in here. Carmen, the question, Andrea Carmen. In the Philippines, Andrea is a name, and Carmen is also a name, so that's the confusion.
I know. It's Carmen is actually my father's last name. His real last name. Valencia is my husband, so I guess I'm Andrea Carmen Valencia. Right.
Yeah. So there are very good comments in here. They were saying that, like, for example, in some certain communities in Latin America, there's la iniciativa del proceso en nuestro sistema de gobernanza. This is somebody from the One Piece community, I guess, in Peru. Al respecto de captar fondos climáticos, es que hemos pensado que primero haríamos el estudio de carbón de nuestro bosque en su conjunto. Este estudio ya tenemos hecho. Considero que para hacer que los pueblos indígenas captemos fondos climáticos es primero hacer el estudio. Very good comment. There's another one from Norma. Nunca se habla en estos foros sobre el avance en los territorios de los pueblos indígenas, de los carteles de drogas, y tiene que ver también con justicia de derechos humanos y clima, porque los territorios ahora se han convertido en pistas de aterrizaje. Sería bueno que los pueblos indígenas y autoridades tomen conciencia y Naciones Unidas debe proteger los territorios del avance de los carteles. A very tough one. A very general comment here: American government violates almost all those rights. We have somebody from, los interesantes que los internacional, en lo internacional se hace mención de avances y en lo nacional hay muchos problemas. Avance de las zonas pobladas, invasión de tierras y territorios, deforestación masiva, entre otros. Question from Australia, I guess, a colleague from Australia. Is Australia part of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples? I think, Carmen, you also responded to that earlier on. There were 4, but they had changed their position afterwards. Very good comments again in Spanish. Maybe if you want to provide any comments on some of those inputs on the chat, Carmen, please go ahead.
Thank you. I know one was asking for my email, and I know there are a lot of questions and comments. So I'm happy to follow up on those. And I think after the final presentations, we'll have some time for questions. And because I was sharing my screen, I haven't had a chance to read all of the questions, but I will and see if there's any particular points. But yes, Australia has changed its initial opposition to the UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Of course, those 4 countries were Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the United States. The United States was the last one in 2010 to reverse its position, and now it says it supports the declaration with some caveats, I have to say, but it doesn't matter. It is a standing declaration. And I just want to make one more comment that because we are using it everywhere, it is taking the force of customary international law. Some countries still say, well, it's just aspirational, it's just a declaration. But the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, adopted in 1948, was not adopted either by full consensus of the General Assembly. But I think no country would say that it's not binding on them, the Universal Declaration. So the more we use it in all of these processes, and Article 42 calls on all the UN agencies as well as countries to implement and follow up on the declaration. So that's part of how we've pushed recognition of the declaration by the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and all of these other UN bodies that we work in. They agreed, the states agreed, the General Assembly agreed, they will implement it. So, you know, let's do it.
Let's do it. That's the spirit.
Do it.
Thank you once again, Andrea, for a very powerful presentation. Really, thank you very much. We are very lucky to have you on board.
Thank
Now,
you.
colleagues, we are now moving to a more institutional presentation, because you see, you have seen and you have heard how Indigenous peoples participate in this triple, I always have difficulty, UNFCCC, UNCCC mechanism. I'm also learning. Now, someone that is internal, who works in fact in this mechanism, is with us. And it's Donna Mitzi Lagdameo, who is currently serving as the officer in charge of the Vulnerability Subdivision at the Secretariat of UNCCC, where she supervises the team dealing with local communities and Indigenous peoples, and with knowledge management and stakeholders engagement for adaptation to climate change. Donna previously worked as Program Management Officer for the UN DRR. I think this is the Disaster Risk Reduction. I'm not really sure now. They have an office in Bonn, and that's where she provided technical support to the global and regional offices of UN DRR, aligning national DRR strategies with national adaptation plan using comprehensive risk management. Without further ado, I'd like to ask Donna now to come on board and to tell us a bit more of this big animal that we are talking about, the UNCCC, the structure, the mechanism in place, and especially those that are specific to Indigenous peoples and local communities. Donna, please.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Very well.
Yes. Okay, let me just share my screen. One sec. Can you see it? All right. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Morris, and thank you, colleagues, for having us in this really interesting and very timely dialogue and workshop. I am Donna, and I'm from the UNFCCC Secretariat, and I'm here to share with you some of the highlights and main agenda items that will be discussed in the 9th meeting of the Facilitative Working Group of the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples platform. So I will not go back in historical development, but I'll give you some glimpse. Thank you so much, Andrea and Ben, for your very for sharing with us from firsthand experience how the process has evolved and how the process has really started to provide space. Not yet the best, not yet perfect, but we are slowly moving in the process. So, ladies and gentlemen, as mentioned previously, the platform was actually created under the Paris Agreement. And at the heart and at the core of the Paris Agreement is really this inclusivity and how everyone has a collective responsibility to really achieve the targets set by the Paris Agreement, both the mitigation targets and adaptation targets and the others. So it's really a shift towards this collective role, and everyone is important and everyone needs to be considered in implementing and really helping us transform to to reach the transformative state that the Paris Agreement has really envisioned. The functions of the platform is threefold. So the function, the platform was created for three things: to really promote and have this knowledge exchange, strengthen capacity of both parties and also the local communities, indigenous peoples, to find ways to really work together and find ways to understand each other, and also, of course, to shape and influence policies from the knowledge, from the experience, from the values, from the generations of wealth, of experience, to help change, help really facilitate the transformative changes that we need to achieve the targets of the Paris Agreement. In your screen is a short timeline from when it was established in 2015 up to where we are right now. So if you can just allow me to quickly run you through, it's 2015, we had the Paris Agreement and the establishment of the platform. 3 years later, we had the establishment of the facilitative working group. This is the constituted body that the Conference of the Parties created to facilitate and implement the functions of the platform. And since then, two work plans have been approved, and we are currently implementing the second 3-year work plan. We are at the timeline that we are at the point, like in the midpoint of the second 3-year work plan. And one sec, oops, sorry. One sec. I think I pressed something, apologies. Can you still see and hear me?
Yes, we do. Yes.
Okay. Okay. I can't see my screen, but so the facilitative working group is a very unique body. It's the only constituted body that actually provides equal footing for parties and for indigenous peoples. And as mentioned earlier by both our colleagues, we have 7 representatives from the 7 sociocultural regions of UN Indigenous Sociocultural Regions and 7 representatives from party groups. So in your screen, this is the summary, and I can just give you a glimpse of the members of the facilitative working group. So, okay. So right now we have Natasha and Onel as the co-chairs of the facilitative working group. And in the next meeting that will start on Wednesday, we will be, the members will be selecting their new co-chairs. But currently we have Natasha and Onel, and by mandate, they also elected the 2 vice co-chairs, and you can see in your screen, which we have Tiana and Gunbrit. So it's always a partnership, from one from parties and one from indigenous, from the indigenous people's representative. There are 7 representatives from parties and 7 representatives from the sociocultural regions. And I would really enjoin everyone who is part of this call to reach out and collaborate and really engage with your regional representatives, and as they are your gateways to really share your views and really share and to be part of the process. They are your representatives, and they are chosen as Andrea mentioned, the self-selection is very much part of the process, and they have a term of 3 years, and they will be members of the facilitative working group until next year. So just to explain a bit, no? So the UNFCCC, we are the secretariat to a very party-driven process, and it's a very formal process which has several layers and several levels of decision making. The biggest and the supreme body is what we call the COP, or the Conference of the Parties to the Framework Convention on Climate Change. We have the CMP, the Conference of the Parties to the Kyoto Protocol, and the CMA, which is the Conference of the Parties to the Paris Agreement. So in all of the meetings, there are distinct agenda items under the COP, under the CMP, and under the CMA, based on the agreed international law, agreed text, and it continues year in and year out. So when we have the COPs, the COP in itself is not an event. The Conference of the Parties is the highest body, and the meetings of the Conference of the Parties is continuing, and they continue to address and discuss agenda items throughout the year. Below the COP, CMP, and CMA, we have the subsidiary bodies. You have the SBSTA and the SBI, and under them you have 17 constituted bodies. One of the 17 constituted bodies is the Facilitative Working Group, and it is, as I mentioned, one of the, or maybe the most unique constituted body that we have. This is essentially the process, and then how we situate the FWG as an entry point to the negotiations. The Facilitative Working Group is the only constituted body that's called facilitative. It's not an expert group, but it really it's not a negotiating body, but it is a technical body meant to implement the work plan. And then it is reviewed every 3 years by the COP for recommendations and guidance from the whole 200+ countries. So the FWG started its meeting in 2019. And next week we will have the 9th meeting. And for those of you who are very familiar in the process, you know that it was mandated for the FWG to meet during the pre-sessionals. So pre-sessionals in the mid-year negotiations and pre-sessionals at the COP. This is where the meetings always take place. And for this year, it will take place also here in Bonn, beginning on Wednesday. So let me go through the agenda itself. This is in your screen is the work plan. This is what we are implementing, and the agenda items in the Facilitative Working Group meeting essentially revolves around the implementation and the different activities under the work plan. It is not a negotiating body, so we are essentially discussing how the FWG is initiating and ensuring that it is implementing the different items in the work plan. We have 9 activities, and under each activity, there are a lot of sub-activities to be implemented. So the meeting will take place in Addis Ababa room in the World Conference Center in Bonn. By mandate, those who can participate in the meetings are parties and observers under the convention. What does this mean? It means that observers who are duly accredited under the convention, and parties are the ones who are allowed to participate in the meeting of the constituted body. It is a formal meeting, and it is meant to discuss agenda items and have the decision at the end of the 4-day meeting for them to be guided on how to ensure that the implementation will be successful and be timely. We are expecting around 140 observers, registered observers in the room. And the meeting will also have a virtual component, and the dedicated access will be given to the officially registered observers and parties. The meeting will also be available in YouTube for webcast for those who want to follow. It will be a fully packed meeting. It is the only constituted body with a lot of with this number of observers, I must say. So we really value the inputs and the contributions of everyone who will be in the room and will join us also virtually. So in your screen again is the indicative schedule. You can download the annotated agenda in the website in the screen as shown in the screen below. And also just to note that this is like an overall plan, but it may be subjected to change because the agenda is provisional until it is adopted by the members on the first day of the meeting. So while this will guide us on how the meetings will progress, just to note that we expect probably some changes here and there. For those who will be coming in Bonn, just to let you know that the meeting will officially start in the afternoon. It will be a closed door session for FWG members only in the morning for them to organize themselves and agree on other items that need to be discussed. But then it will be formally opened at 2 o'clock in the afternoon in the room, as I mentioned. We have 10 agenda items, and allow me to just quickly walk you through. So under agenda item 2, this is where we will be formally adopting the provisional agenda, and then also the election of co-chairs and vice co-chairs. So after that, there will be a small handover ceremony for the 2 co-chairs to the new ones, and then we move to the next agenda item. The agenda item 3, so it builds upon the decisions made in FWG 8 in Sharm. And one of the core decisions from the facilitative working group is really how to ensure that the contributions of local communities and indigenous peoples are well embedded in the global goal on adaptation and the global stocktake. So this will be the first agenda item. And Ben mentioned earlier the contributions. So last year, there was a formal contribution submitted by the FWG to the GST process, and an updated one will be coming soon. And with new examples and new case studies that were submitted through the Indigenous Peoples representatives in the facilitative working group. So that will be forthcoming. After agenda item 3, we focus on agenda item 4. In January, there was a retreat held by the members here in Bonn. However, the decision-making process only happens in formal meetings. So the agreements they had in January will only be formally adopted in the FWG 9 under agenda item 4. Agenda item 5 will essentially discuss the activities at the regional level and the plans and how they can ensure that these plans will take place. We have until next year to implement the work plan, and then next year there will also be the development of the third 3-year work plan. Agenda item 6 will be essentially that. The development of the new 3-year work plan will start next year, actually at the SBs, and which will be then adopted at COP29 next year. Also at COP29 will be the review of FWG. Just to let you know, FWG is not required to submit formal reports to the SBSTA and the Conference of the Parties every year. It takes place every 3 years, and the next review and the submission of the official report will be done next year under COP29. Agenda item 8 will essentially be about the collaboration with the different constituted bodies, PCCB, the GCF, internal and external. So 6.8 colleagues will also be in the room, and then also we expect some updates from the GCF colleagues, and also from IPCC and others. The details are all in the annotated agenda, which is in the website. Last will be any other matters which the FWG members may want to include in the discussions, and then we move to the closing of the meeting afterwards. So all of these will be discussed in 4 days, and at the end of the meeting there will be a set of decisions that will be adopted by the members, by the constituted body as a whole, for guidance and implementation. In addition to the FWG 9, we will have 2 mandated events at the SB sessions. This is one is under activity 4 and one is under activity 5 of the work plan. So the information is there. So I will really hope that you can join us, especially in the capacity building for local communities and indigenous peoples under activity 4. This is module 2 of the set of topics. The first one was done, I think, 2 weeks ago, virtually, and we will continue having these modules throughout the year. I will end there, and if you have any other questions, we are happy to connect with you. Do email us, and then for other questions, I am happy to take them now if we have time. Back to you, Morse.
Thank you, Donna, for giving us a very succinct and an overview of the agenda, most especially of the forthcoming 9th meeting of the facilitated working group, and also giving us a glimpse of of this whole process in UNFCCC. I think we do have colleagues who provided comments in some part of the chat, but one of the questions that was raised in our chat back is that from Romeo Atillo, Donna, ¿podría explicar brevemente algún logro importante de las reuniones? I think she's asking if you could give, briefly some of the achievements, key achievements, important achievements of the meetings of the facilitated working group. I think that's the question, if I understood properly. And then I think that's one of the key questions raised. Is there anybody else who would like to ask questions to Donna concerning the next session on the facilitated working group? There is a question on una pregunta, ¿cómo se seleccionan los participantes y cuáles son los niveles de participación de los pueblos indígenas de los países? Is asking about how participants are being selected. And then another question, how are teams of various roundtables during COP are being decided? And how can we ensure that the voice of indigenous peoples are streamlined at this level? So I think, Donna, we have couple of comments and also questions for you. So please go ahead.
Thank you, Morris, and thank you, colleagues, for your questions. I will start with the last one on the roundtables. So in the different meetings, for example, the global stocktake, these are led by co-facilitators appointed by the Conference of the Parties, and they have initiated calls for submissions, for inputs on how to move forward the discussions in the global stocktake. And based on this, the co-facilitators then decided on the types of roundtables. I'm happy to inform you that for the GST roundtables next in the first week of the SBs, there is a specific roundtable for indigenous peoples. So please do take part and have your voices heard in these discussions, and it will be facilitated by one of the FWG members, and also other members of the constituted body. So it is there's a process, an agreed process in the formal body, and we are following the process agreed by the parties. On the selection process of participants, so the FWG is a formal constituted body, and just like any other bodies, we get directions from the COP. So as I showed earlier, the COP said that those who can attend are from representatives from parties and the observers under the convention, which means these are there is a process for accreditation, not the best process, but and I must say there are challenges there, but it's unfortunately the only one that we have right now. But with your continued push, I'm sure there will be continued changes. At the end of the day, any changes that the Secretariat can do will be based on COP decisions. So inputs that you will be giving through the parties, and the parties will be deciding, then that will initiate really the systemic changes at all levels in the entire system. Achievements of the FWG, I think we would be great to hear that from Andrea, who was part of the FWG at some point in time. But I must say from the top of my head, the FWG has really, through the years, we have seen how parties and how different constituted bodies have really increased the recognition and the importance of local communities and indigenous peoples. We are now, while we have the nine-point work plan, we are also very busy engaging with other constituted bodies who have now been mandated to ensure that they interact and they work closely with the FWG. So we are really seeing these are the positive impacts of your continued engagement in the process. There are activities. So the work plan is very activity-based. So the actions and the work plan has provided us opportunity to actually conduct regional gatherings where we will be engaging with indigenous peoples at the regional level, and these are platforms that are open to everyone. So these are, I think they have really facilitated the engagement and facilitated the recognition of parties on the importance and the value addition of everything that local communities and indigenous peoples can contribute in the achievement of the Paris Agreement and of the convention. So I think I won't be able to go to different details, but then I think overall it has helped us gain momentum, and that it has helped us really open up the space. So we can have really the inclusivity that the Paris Agreement has hoped for and has mandated countries to actually do. I will stop there. I think I have covered the three, but if you have any other questions, feel free to email us, and we hope for those who are coming to Bonn next week. See you.
Thank you, Donna. Maraming salamat. Just to give the floor, I think I could see Andrea's hand. Andrea, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Donna. Also, we'll see you soon. I think the question was, how are the members selected? And I will go back to what I presented as a former member and former co-chair of the FWG. This is a very unique, historic, maybe revolutionary process implementing Article 18 of the UN Declaration, which says Indigenous peoples representatives selected by ourselves. And each region, there are 7 regional seats. for the 7, what they call socio-cultural regions of Indigenous peoples, which we determined back when we were establishing the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous issues. And each of those regions is responsible for selecting their own representative for a 3-year period. Then it changes to another 3. We have a North America Indigenous Peoples working group on climate change, made up of all the organizations in US and Canada, tribes and nations as well, that participate in this process. So that's how the selection is done here. And each region has its own regional body that works to do the nominations and selections. So it is very direct and participatory in that way. I'm going to just add another couple, highlight another couple primary contributions, reminding from my presentation, one thing the FWG, Facilitative Working Group, has done is ensure the formal participation of Indigenous knowledge holders. And the second that was put into place in the 2nd-year work plan and took place in Sharm el-Sheikh is the direct participation from Indigenous youth. And those knowledge holders and those youth are also selected on a regional basis. The first time when I coordinated that activity, co-coordinated it, we asked each region to select 4 knowledge holders. And these are Indigenous peoples doing the work on the ground. Food producers, spiritual leaders, etc. So, and we asked them, each region, to choose at least 1 woman and 1 youth. I will say North America, I'm happy to say, selected 2 Indigenous women and 2 Indigenous youth for this last time. And then I think last year, each region got to select 6 to participate directly and in person. And part of the most important thing for me, at least, was the ability of those knowledge holders to share with each other. The first time we had a closed meeting just of Indigenous peoples where they could really speak openly about their knowledge, practices, threats, recommendations. And then we had a meeting separately after with the state parties to share those outcomes. And that's, I think, basically the way we're going to do the upcoming bi-regional gathering of Latin America, Caribbean with North America, which we hope will take place this fall. So one of the most important things is for Indigenous peoples to come together ourselves to talk with each other about our solutions and ideas and strategies for dealing with this issue. The last thing I'll say is in the first 3 years, we were able to get a rights framework formalized for Indigenous knowledge. The first thing you see when you open up the portal for the LSIP is a paragraph on rights. We're not going to print or publish actual knowledge, but more programs, projects, strategies, conference outcomes, etc. So we're trying to do our best to protect Indigenous knowledge based on free, prior, and informed consent and formal affirmation of those rights in this process. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea, for those additional inputs, valuable ones. And Donna?
Just one final point, and I think just to add that the facilitative working group has really helped us widen the reach, and we really encourage everyone, engage with your regional representatives. We really want we really want you to take part of the platform and use the platform to help us reach the goals of the Paris Agreement. It is there for everyone, for all the Indigenous peoples and local communities to take part of and engage, and it would be really great if you can continue. There are opportunities to share your stories and upload stuff there. Visit the website and do reach out to us, and we will be happy to hear from you and really get your contributions, especially in the key processes, the Global Goal and Adaptation, the GST, wherein they have explicitly recognized the roles and the leadership roles of local communities, indigenous people. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Donna. Indeed, there's a public demand. They wanted to have you share your email in the chat group, in the chat box. So if you could do that, because I think they will be asking, I think, a couple of questions as a follow-up. But yeah, once again, colleagues, thank you. We are over halfway of the session now. And at this point, by now, you understood more or less the big picture of the UNFCCC as a mechanism, as a body. And then, of course, now you have seen the more specific mechanisms where indigenous people could participate. And thank you for our 3 colleagues who have provided us those initial sessions. One that provides us an overview of why it's important to anchor climate change to human rights. And then the second one is to go back to our history of indigenous participation in the process of the climate change negotiation. And then we have a colleague from the organization itself giving us the internal information of the mechanism itself, how it operates, the structure, the decision-making processes, and where indigenous peoples can get in. Now, what we're going to have now are people who have actually used those mechanisms, have seen them, have been a part of the formation of those mechanisms. And I am very happy to introduce to you one of our next speaker is Lakpa Sherpa, who is the lead of the Asia Indigenous Peoples Foundation on climate change. Lakpa is going to lead us on the session on how to be effective indigenous advocate and how to be meaningful in our work when engaged on these processes. So just very briefly on Lakpa, as I have mentioned, he works with AIPP. This is the regional organization, the biggest one in Asia. It's based in Chiang Mai in Thailand, and it's been doing work on indigenous peoples at the regional secretariat since 2011. Lakpa has been playing an important role in building and strengthening the capacity and policy advocacy on indigenous peoples, indigenous women, youth, and climate change, including biodiversity and indigenous people's right to local, national, regional, and at the international level. He is actively supporting international climate movement of indigenous peoples as the focal person of the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change. I have seen him in action. So Lakpa, please, thank you very much for joining us. It's all yours.
Thank you, Morris. Thank you very much for that introduction. And thank you to Donna, Andrea, and also Ben for really setting that very good context to discuss the participation of indigenous peoples. I really wanted to be part of the discussion, the family of indigenous peoples have really grown and we're becoming more powerful in terms of the engagement of indigenous peoples. Anyway, as Morris said, I will be talking more on the full and effective participation of indigenous peoples, because as a focal point, I basically engaged with UN People's Secretariat and also with indigenous peoples at the international level. But then the role that I play from our organization also grounds me at the local and also at the national level. So I'll try to put my sharing in terms of the participation at different levels so that some of the new people who may be in this meeting could actually see or relate themselves in terms of their engagement in this climate change process. So let me share my screen. Can you see, Morris, my screen?
Yes, we can see. Beautiful photos again.
All right, thanks. So just to say that, there is this whole picture that's coming out that indigenous peoples are the victims of climate change, so many things that are going negative in the territories of indigenous peoples. One of the approaches that Asia indigenous peoples have taken in the region is also to show the leadership. I think Donna and Adrian mentioned a lot about how indigenous peoples in different parts of the world are taking leadership role in terms of mitigating and adapting to the impacts of climate change. And this is the story of a very powerful set of indigenous women in northern Thailand that AIPP has documented. And I'm very happy to say that I was there last week to hand over their stories of leadership in Thai, English, and indigenous languages. And this is the kind of documentation of the leadership of indigenous women that AIPP will be bringing towards the climate change and the CBD process. I tried to reflect on in terms of what could be the content, like when Morris asked me to focus more on the full and effective participation. So I thought that maybe it's good to discuss by formulating questions at different levels and try to present both the opportunities and challenges that indigenous peoples have at international, national, and also at local level. But before I go to my sharing, I would like to share that being a focal point of the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change, I play a significant role between the Indigenous Peoples Caucus and the Climate Change Secretariat. So my role at the international level would also be to facilitate the participation of indigenous peoples from all the 7 regions of the world. So I have seen questions in the previous sharing that how can we participate in the climate change meetings and things like that. There is a listserv for indigenous peoples who have been engaging in this process for a long time. And if you want to be part of that listserv and get information in terms of what is happening, what kind of meeting is coming in the upcoming months, you'll all be notified through that listserv. So feel free to, I'll later share my email, and then you can let me know if you are interested to be part of that whole listserv of climate change families that we have at UNFCCC. Okay, having said that, I think the basic question that we should ask ourselves as indigenous peoples working at different levels, where are we in this whole discussion of climate change? Are we reflected as rights holders, or are we reflected more as victims or beneficiaries of climate change? So I would encourage all of you to actually see the Climate Change Convention text that was adopted in 1992. If any of you have read that text of the Climate Change Conventions, there is an Article 7 and paragraph 6 that talks about how non-state actors, meaning like observers, can participate in the climate change process. As Donna has clearly said, this is a party-led process, meaning that we are not sitting in the decision-making table, we are observers. And Ben made it very clear that there is a crisis of human rights across the world. And it makes it even more important for us to actually be part of the decision-making. But if you really look at the current structure, we are more as observers engaging in the process. So as an observer, we get to make interventions in the opening and closing plenaries. So as indigenous peoples organizations, we get 2 to 3 minutes interventions. And also we get to have a meeting with the co-chairs of the SBI and Substat that Donna was explaining. But one of the challenges that we are facing was there was no specific space for indigenous peoples to share, discuss, and recommend the issues and challenges that they are facing at the ground. And I think it has already been mentioned that there is a local communities and indigenous peoples platform that came out of the Paris Agreement. This was very significant achievements for indigenous peoples participation to have their own space for discussions. And I'm very happy and proud to also say that the first co-chair of that platform was from Asia, and also from my community, she's Pasang Dolma Sherpa, the co-chair of the Indigenous Peoples platform. But then when you see the participation of indigenous peoples at the national level, we don't have a mechanism like local communities and indigenous peoples platform. In many of the countries in Asia, and most probably this is the case with other regions as well, indigenous peoples participate mostly to the multi-stakeholders. So there are other stakeholders also that becomes part of the process. And in some of the mechanism that I'm aware of, there is also representation of indigenous peoples in some of the working group and some of the climate change bodies. But one of the challenges that they face is they're just one in number, but there are so many other representatives of government. So we are just in minority in terms of influencing the discussion of the working group. So that's the specific challenge that indigenous peoples are facing at the national level in terms of the participation. So I really feel that there should be a way that we can bring down the mechanism that we have at LCIP at the national level. I'm not saying that it has to be exactly the same. There could be an ongoing mechanism at national level that could actually be transformed to have more spaces for indigenous peoples at the national level. And then the other question that I want to discuss with you, and I think this is something that you can relate with as you are working at different levels, is have the climate change agreements and decision acknowledge the rights and knowledge of indigenous peoples. And I would like to again bring you back in 1992 when this CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, the climate change, and the whole Convention on Desertification came out from the OHCHR Summit in 1992. If you really read, I think it is a 25-page long text on the convention, there is no reference to indigenous peoples at all. And then I also encourage all of you to read the Kyoto Protocol that came out in 1997, because that was a legally binding agreement, especially for the Annex 1 countries, the rich one, the developed countries, to reduce their carbon emissions. I think it is a 21-page long document, and there is no reference to indigenous peoples. That actually shows that how indigenous peoples were not part of the process or even part of the decision-making in those years. And I think one of the reasons could also be that climate change was more seen a very technical issues, like how would you measure carbon, like in tons and things like that. But then once the discussion on deforestation and forest degradation came into the picture of climate change, and of course, forests is home for many of the millions of indigenous peoples across the world. And that's where I think indigenous peoples became more active in the climate change process, and this whole formulation of the International Indigenous Peoples on climate change came into the being. And after that, it was in 2009, for the first time, I think maybe in the history of the climate change process, indigenous peoples from all the 7 regions came in Anchorage. And there is a specific declaration that came out from the meeting, and I again encourage all of you to read, because there are so many recommendations that are still yet to be fulfilled at the UNFCCC. And I would like to encourage you to read the recommendation number, let me check, number 4 in the Anchorage declarations. That was the first global declaration that came out from indigenous peoples. It reads, we call upon UNFCCC decision-making bodies to establish formal structures and mechanisms for the full and effective participation of indigenous peoples. This was done in 2009. And I could relate these recommendations to the platform, the local communities and indigenous peoples platform that we have had. And of course, Andrea and Donna discussed a lot about how significant this space is. So I would recall the linkages, right? That this has been something indigenous peoples actually articulated in 2009 through these Anchorage declarations. And then, of course, now because indigenous peoples became more active through a formalization of the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change, if you see the Paris Agreement that came out in 2015, then we are part of that, the agreement. But one of the things I think which Andrea also highlighted, that actually indigenous people really wanted to be part of that objective of the Paris Agreement. And just to also recall that there was a specific takes on human rights and the rights of indigenous peoples in the objective of the Paris Agreement, but then it got watered down and then it was deleted on the Human Rights Day in 2015. So which is of course a very sad part that we're not able to have that explicitly on the objective of the Paris Agreement. But then as Ben explained, there is a specific reference to the rights of indigenous peoples and human rights in the preamble of the Paris Agreement. So those are some of the achievements that we're able to have it because of the more engagement of indigenous peoples in the climate change. And I think 2015 was the year where many of the indigenous peoples participated from all the 7 regions of the world. And then talking about, again, the climate change agreements for indigenous peoples, it is not enough just to have the good agreements at the international level. If that international agreement doesn't get implemented at the national level, it doesn't value much for the indigenous peoples. And Andrea articulated very well, despite the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in 2007, and we're now in 2023, the implementation is still very, very weak. And this is the case in the context of climate change as well. And many of you already know that in order to implement the Paris Agreement, the countries have to have their nationally determined contribution, which is called NDC. And AIPP, my organizations, did a very comprehensive research in 10 countries in Asia that clearly states, that clearly shows that indigenous peoples are still invisible as rights holders, we're still invisible as knowledge holders, and invisible as partners. So that means there's still a lot of work that needs to be done at the national level in order to influence the NDC. So just to give you a context that having international agreements is not enough for indigenous peoples unless it gets implemented at the national level. And just also reiterate that some of the policy measures that actually are in place in the name of climate change and conservation actually criminalize indigenous people's traditional way of life. Just to give you a very specific example on that, the traditional livelihood of indigenous peoples that is very common in Asia is called rotational agriculture. And in the discussion of deforestation and forest degradation, it has been identified as one of the drivers of deforestation. And any indigenous person that actually practices that kind of cultivations gets arrested and even criminalized. So that's the other side of the climate change measures is actually affecting the livelihoods of indigenous peoples. On the question number third, and I think those of you who have participated in the climate change process knows it very well that many of the discussion happens in English. Of course, in the plenary meetings, there is a translation provided for the 6 UN language, but then when there are contact groups, it all happens in language. And it automatically limits the participation of indigenous peoples to contribute to that kind of discussions, because not everybody going to that kind of meeting are fluent in English or understand English or make a textual proposal in English. And I think this is especially very, very difficult for knowledge holders to actually engage in the negotiations. But also it's good to acknowledge that there are good people with good command in English from indigenous peoples from different regions that actually are providing significant roles to bridge that gap that is there. When we come down to the national level, and I think in Asia, we don't have a regional language like in other regions. And even in one country, there are so many indigenous languages, which makes it even more challenging to have the effective participation and contribution to the national policy discussions. And some of the challenges that our members in the region are facing is also, we get a very late or short notice to actually be part of the meeting. And sometimes even they have to cover their own financial costs for transportation and accommodations to attend some of the meetings. I mean, which automatically limits, right? Because not everybody has resources to travel and attend the meeting. And this is even more challenging to indigenous women and persons with disability in the context of this kind of engagement. I will talk a bit later about the financing, but then just to say it here that indigenous women and youth networks are among the least resourced networks in the context of Asia. Okay, the other question that I want to discuss with you is how are indigenous women, youth, and indigenous persons with disability participation faring in the nationally determined contributions? The research that we did in 10 countries, it shows that indigenous women, indigenous youth, and indigenous persons with disability are almost invisible in the nationally determined contributions. There is more general reference to women and youth, but there is no specific reference to indigenous women and indigenous youth. Indigenous person with disability is not mentioned at all in the NDC of the 10 countries that we studied. And also to say that I'm actually happy to see that some of the indigenous person with disability representative from Asia has started engaging in the climate change process, which is really good that they can bring the realities and the voices for the people that they represent. In terms of the and I think this could be also relating to some of the questions that people have raised. How much is actually indigenous peoples receiving the climate financing? And we have heard from the previous speakers that indigenous peoples do not have any contributions to the change in the climate systems, but are in the front line to bear the brunt of climate change. Despite this, indigenous peoples are taking leadership role in the conservation of 80% of the world's biodiversity. So people who are consuming 80% of the world's biodiversity is receiving very little. And I think there was a research done by RFN that says that less than 1% of the climate financing is actually reaching to indigenous peoples, which to me is climate injustice, because indigenous peoples are the custodians of the last remaining biodiversity, but they are being very less resourced in terms of the climate finance. And I think this is the situation that has to change over time. And just also said that there's a lot of discussions going around in the international level and also in our region, that how do we facilitate a mechanism so that indigenous peoples can directly access more funds so that they can strengthen their organization, strengthen their movement, and also influence the policy, because the gap currently is really the national level. The policies are not aligned with what has been agreed at the international level, and you can imagine the kind of implementation that happens at the local level when national level laws and policies are not aligned what came out from the international level. Okay, so that's on funding. I also would like to briefly touch in terms of the worldviews of indigenous peoples and the business, because I think this is very important topic that we should all be discussing about, because the way we relate to our land, territories, and water from the cultural aspect is way different from what the business sector looks towards our land, territories, and resources. Because for us, land, territories, and resources are sacred to us, but for business, it's profit, it's business. So I think there is the perspective that is there that looking towards the indigenous peoples to change. And I think this is also the reason why there's a lot of the violations of the rights of indigenous peoples taking place in the name of conservations. And I think I've already said that in the context of conservation and climate change, the traditional livelihoods of indigenous peoples are being restricted and criminalized in the context of climate change discussion. So this has to be shared by indigenous peoples at different levels and even in the platform, because for me, just promoting the knowledge of indigenous peoples, giving them participation is not enough if the violation of indigenous people still continues on the ground, if indigenous peoples are still evicted from their territories for the sake of climate change mitigation and adaptation, because those things has to stop if we really want to promote the knowledge and practices of indigenous peoples. And I would like to conclude with the importance that actually Ben mentioned about the need to bring the climate change and biodiversity together, because for indigenous peoples, we don't say that this knowledge is for climate or this specific knowledge is for the biodiversity. The way we look towards our resource management systems is very holistic. And this came out already very clearly in the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, as Ben mentioned, that came out from COP15 in Montreal, that already shows the linkages between climate change and biodiversity. Because if you have read the IFP-based assessment report, it clearly says that climate change is a driver of biodiversity loss. And we know it very clearly that healthy biodiversity is needed to address climate change. So I think there is a need for us to advocate and pressure the government to have an integrated approach to address both climate change and biodiversity. And I think it's also the role that indigenous peoples organizations should play at the national level when government revise the NBSAP to also see the interlinkages that is there with the NDC. And at least in the Asia, we have felt this, and actually I was discussing with Jing also, we had a separate panel this afternoon that we will be doing an annual environmental conference every year starting this year to really bring the climate change and biodiversity together and really have a very consolidated strategy of Asian indigenous peoples and really maximize basically resources, right? We cannot be doing one meeting for climate change and one meeting for biodiversity at the regional level. So this is the kind of the direction that indigenous peoples in Asia are going forward. Just to conclude with, I think over the years, from my personal experiences, our family, like I said earlier, our family, climate change family, has really grown. And I can really see the difference that was there in 2011 when I came in, and now the family has really grown. And I think, and the contribution that Voluntary Fund and the LCIP is providing to bring in more people, youth, women, and knowledge holders really adds value to the ongoing advocacy of indigenous peoples at the international level. So just to again say that there will be a preparatory meeting of indigenous peoples on 4th June, because this is the usual process that Indigenous Peoples Caucus has to make sure that we all meet together before the meeting, discuss the priority, and go out with a very consolidated recommendations when we engage in the Bonn conference. And if you need more information about this preparatory meeting of Indigenous Peoples, feel free to reach out to me, and also I'll share my email and we can have further communication on that. I'll just stop there and thank you for your attention. Back to you, Morse.
Thank you, Lakpa, for really sharing a very personal and insightful presentation, taking a very stepping back and really reflecting on what has been some of the most important and salient achievement that we have had at the international level. But I think you also put a very challenging question of are we actually bringing these changes to our communities, to our organization? Because if we don't do that, then we lost the battle. And then, of course, it's also important to mention that, that even within the indigenous communities, we do have people who are much more vulnerable than others. And you mentioned that, that are we actually bringing those who are most vulnerable right in front, like indigenous women, indigenous youth, person with disabilities. And most importantly, I think your last comment on how indigenous peoples link different thematic issues and not put them in boxes and in silos, because otherwise, then we won't be able to look at indigenous issues in a holistic manner. If we don't do that, then, we're like putting band-aid, in all the different problems that we are having. Your session is pretty much linked with the last session. And this is how we did it deliberately. And this is, from trying to find out, the effective and meaningful participation of indigenous peoples. We are now moving into how do we localize, these important processes? How do we ensure that what's happening in Bonn, in Montreal, actually touch down at home? Whether this is in Cordillera or this is in the Amazon or in the Karamojong community in Uganda, for example. We are very lucky to have Jing with us. But I could see a hand. Donna, do you want to come in before I hand over to Jing?
I can come in later, so
all right,
to complete
okay.
Thank you.
Wonderful. So Jing is going to work with us on this very important topic of bringing global climate change negotiations to the communities and regions and back. Good practices and lessons learned. Maybe it's also good to mention bad practices, Jing, because those are the things that we learn the most. Just to give you a bit of a background of Jing, Jing is a Kankanai Igorot from the indigenous peoples in the northern Cordillera in the Philippines, a lawyer by profession, is currently the managing director for policy at Tero. She is a leader, negotiator, and expert of International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Biodiversity, on area-based conservation and indigenous peoples' rights, including access access and benefit sharing digital sequence information. Wow. For the first time, I'm learning that, DSI. She is a former coordinator of the Indigenous Peoples Rights and Policy Advocacy Program of DEBDEBA, Indigenous Peoples International Center for Policy Research and Education. And in 2012, with Indigenous Intellectual Property Fellow at the World Intellectual Property Organization. Jing is a member of the Indigenous Advisory Panel of LEAF, and I think LEAF means lowering emission by accelerating foreign finance coalition, and a board member of the Integrity Council of the Voluntary Carbon Market, where she advises on proper observance of safeguard on the rights of Indigenous peoples. Wow, Jing, there's a lot of technical words in there, but really, I think we have chosen you precisely for that. So we're giving you the floor now, please. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Morris, and thanks to the rest of the presenters for laying the groundwork. You know, I just build on from what has already been presented by the others. All right, so the UNFCCC is an international agreement, and most of what has been presented pertains to the international aspect of the work. However, all of these international agreements need to be implemented at the national level in order to take effect. So the UN Climate Convention, precisely from the name, is a framework convention. So UNFCCC, UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which means that it has to be implemented through national legislation, through national laws. And what does this mean at the national level? The laws will have to be implementing or putting in place ways to meet the objectives of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. But at the same time, it's important for us that work on the ground to be able to look at these laws. And you know, I was quite surprised because the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was adopted in 1992, and it's reasonable to assume that almost all countries now have national level laws, or within the first 10 years of the ratification or of the adoption of the Climate Convention. However, in 2021, Uganda managed to put in place its national climate law. So it seems like there are still processes ongoing. And as we know, all of these laws, they have to be amended. I mean, most laws, they get amended at some point. And I think this is the first stop where Indigenous peoples need to be engaged. We need to be able to be part of the process of crafting and amending national laws that would implement the convention. Hand in hand with these processes of developing national legislation is the process to develop national climate change action plans. And these plans get updated from time to time. So in the Philippines, for example, what we have done is to form a coalition along with others who are concerned with the topic of climate change. And we established this network called Action Klima, which means action on the climate. And this is the vehicle by which Indigenous peoples are able to participate to influence the process of crafting national legislation, the implementing rules, as well as the action plans. So that's the first stop. Because it's a framework convention, we have to be able to monitor the laws that are put in place at the national level to implement commitments under the convention. And then the previous panelists talked about the Paris Agreement. And under the Paris Agreement, countries are supposed to develop their NDCs. And given that preambular paragraph 11 mentions the rights of Indigenous peoples, there is the necessity for Indigenous peoples to be part of the process of crafting these NDCs. However, unfortunately, as Lakpa has said, based on their analysis, there are very, very few NDCs that actually mention Indigenous peoples or have had the opportunity for Indigenous input. I think it's also necessary in many cases, given that we are under assault, not just from the effects of climate change, but also from the potential violations that will be caused by solutions proposed to climate change. For example, carbon markets. I think it's very important in the different countries for the issue of carbon rights to be clarified. And again, Indigenous peoples have to be part of that. Because if carbon rights is recognized as something that national governments have rights over, then we may be bypassed in discussions about how to value carbon, but also how to trade carbon. And recognizing our rights is important because then free, prior, and informed consent comes into play. So, for example, 15 years ago in the Philippines, we had to undergo an exercise by which we analyzed the laws and we tried to determine who actually has the rights to the carbon. And it was quite clear under the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act of the Philippines that Indigenous peoples own the land, but not just the land, they also own and have authority over the subsoil and everything above land. Okay, so it's important for us to be involved in discussions such as this, so that we can establish that Indigenous peoples, we have rights in whatever decisions that the government makes on who owns the carbon and on how they trade carbon. I think one of the key announcements in recent years and one of the key preoccupations in the upcoming COP is the issue of carbon finance. And oh, sorry, I'll take a step back before I go to carbon finance. When we talk about carbon rights and carbon credits and carbon trading, it's inevitable that we talk about REDD+. And as for reasons that Andrea has explained earlier, this could be perceived as a new form of colonization. However, in some cases, the debate around REDD+ and who has the rights to the carbon has enabled Indigenous peoples to have a foot in the door in terms of discussing rights of Indigenous peoples or even recognition of Indigenous peoples as Indigenous peoples in certain governments. For example, in Vietnam, Indigenous peoples there were not recognized as Indigenous peoples up until the discussion started raging around REDD+. And under REDD+, we have the Cancun safeguards. The Cancun safeguards require consent of Indigenous peoples. That's part of the safeguards whenever we talk about REDD+. And so the Vietnamese government, because they were interested in engaging in REDD+, had no choice but to engage with entities that they regarded as local communities at the time. And they had no choice but to recognize them as Indigenous peoples because of the requirements under the Cancun safeguards. So these are some examples of opportunities that Indigenous peoples have taken in order to advance their rights as Indigenous peoples and the recognition as Indigenous peoples. Excuse me. All right, so let's move on to the issue of climate finance. There are different forms of finance. We have multilateral finance, we have bilateral finance, we have philanthropic money, as well as money that finance that should be flowing from the carbon markets. And in all of these discussions, it's been recognized that Indigenous peoples, well, it's been asserted that Indigenous peoples need to have direct access to the different kinds of finance. And this advocacy has been advanced by indigenous peoples, both at the global level, but more importantly, at the national level. I would take the Philippines again as an example, where as a result of advocacy for funds to flow to indigenous peoples, there was national law implemented on the People's Survival Fund. This is an adaptation fund because, as we very well know, most of the finance has been flowing towards mitigation rather than adaptation. And so at the national level, it was successfully argued that because the Philippines is a very highly vulnerable country, then it's necessary for finance to be devoted to adaptation. And because indigenous peoples were part of this discussion, um, there was the possibility of indigenous peoples as self-governing entities to be able to apply for the People's Survival Fund. Now, the issue of ease of access is a completely different issue, and that permeates all of the discussions in relation to finance, whether it's multilaterals, bilaterals, or national funding. So it's not that easy. Although there is the possibility of indigenous peoples accessing it, the requirements are quite difficult, as we've seen also when it comes to the Green Climate Fund. Okay. Then, lastly, what I would like to bring up is the issue of impact on the ground of transition minerals. There is a decision for countries essentially to cut carbon emissions and have a low carbon development strategy. And because of the desire to cut emissions um, and to make the transition from dirty energy to clean energy, um, because of this pressure to change, now mining for minerals that would be used in electric cars, batteries, and so forth, what we regard as clean energy, um, there's a tendency for consent to be bypassed in the process of mining some of these transition minerals. And we've seen that happening in the different indigenous territories where nickel and other types of transition minerals can be found. So this is something that we have to deal with, and we have to look for who's accountable, um, for these violations of rights in the process of the green transition. There are many indigenous communities that are affected by dams, and and again, it's because dams are regarded as clean energy, and because it's clean energy, it somehow justifies bypassing the safeguards for indigenous peoples. There are also examples of windmills. This was brought up by the Sami people in many different forums, in the different COPs, and also in the permanent forum this year. Because windmills are a form of clean energy, the governments now feel that they have the justification to bypass the consent of indigenous peoples and, just affecting adversely the traditional occupations of indigenous peoples in the pursuit of this clean energy. So, in summary, it's important that all of the international agreements that we've fought so hard to influence, be translated at the national level and implemented in a way that benefits indigenous peoples. And there are many ways to do this, forming alliances, but also strengthening our voice as indigenous peoples on the ground and documenting how we have contributed to the solutions to climate change and how our knowledge plays an important role in addressing the challenge of climate change. But at the same time, it's important to document experiences on the ground so that it can be brought up in international spaces and it can be used to influence how global policies are crafted. So right now, it's more important than ever to be able to critique these new forms of colonization in the form of taking over of indigenous lands for low carbon development strategies, and carbon trading. Maybe the last example I will cite is the current problem that our Indigenous brothers and sisters are facing in Guyana. In the desire of the government to receive money, carbon credits from the forests that are currently standing in Guyana, they have gone ahead with a deal with an oil company to sell carbon credits. And in the process, they have bypassed consultations on the ground. In addition, in the low carbon development strategy, they have pegged the share of Indigenous peoples from the proceeds at 15%, arguing that only 15% of the land of the total land of Guyana has been titled and demarcated as Indigenous lands. And the problem with this is that they have limited the share of Indigenous peoples, and they have provided a disincentive for further titling or completion of the pending demarcation and titling of Indigenous lands. Because it's quite clear that it's not just 15% of the land of Guyana that is owned by Indigenous peoples. So these are the problems that these kinds of issues bring to the ground. And again, what Indigenous peoples are doing is to bring these issues to the global space, to point out that there are loopholes in the current policies, especially on jurisdictional REDD+. So again, it's a feedback loop, and what happens at the global level needs to affect the local level, and what happens in the local level needs to push development of policy at the global level. And I'll end there because I know we're running out of time. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Gain. Oh my goodness, I thought your topic would be the most, easy to deal with, because it's about bringing and bringing discussion on the ground and really ensuring that it's echoed, at the global level. But I thought I was learning a new language. It's incredible, but really, it's really an incredible listening to you. I have learned so much from your inputs, especially the good practices and some of the bad practices. I'm glad that you touched on that, and really sharing, what the impact of a really bad practice, basics as not respecting pre-prior informed consent, and at the same time not losing your hope when even a government doesn't recognize Indigenous peoples, and just and realize that in fact that's when knowledge is power, when you know that a REDD+ mechanism could actually be used and sometimes misused and heard in other parts of the world. And I think those are the things that that we need to be aware of. I think I have really took note really two important lessons learned that you mentioned. The forming of alliances. I think we have seen this. I think one of the most important aspect of the Indigenous movement globally is the forming of alliances. And we have seen this, how beautiful it is. I think many groups, international, they even see when you talk about forming alliances, they use Indigenous global movement as a very good example. And this formation of alliances, we don't only see that at the global level, we see that at the regional, and we see it at the national level. And we also see that in different sectors. Now we have climate change. Look at, you could count on your hand. I remember people were complaining here in Geneva, for example, when the UN Forum on Business and Human Rights, when it was very new, there were like 5 people, Indigenous peoples, and they were like, oh my God, what are these people doing here? Last year, it was incredible. We had over almost 100 people. And that is the power of building alliances. And really, when we bring people coming from Bonn to Geneva and back, New York, Nairobi, and where else, that's an incredible example. I think the other example that you mentioned, and I think this is something that really Indigenous peoples have to really take it seriously, it's documenting practices, showing contribution, so that those contributions on the ground can actually come to the global space and be seen, be heard, so that then they can be used as examples of a solution. Because in many parts of the world, you know, like I'm going to connect what Lakpa has mentioned before, the narrative when Indigenous people come in those meetings, we are the victim. And I think there's this shift of the narrative that Indigenous peoples are not just victim. There are solutions. And I think that was a very good way of putting it. You have given the example of Guyana. I think that was incredible. But for me, the example of Vietnam was, I would keep that. I think I would remember that. I will be giving that an example in other trainings. Colleagues, I think we have about 10 minutes. What I would like to do is I would like to ask the floor for any comments or questions. Please use our chat. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask all our speakers to leave their contact details so that anyone who would like to follow up on any topic, please do so. And what I would like to do is maybe, I don't know if we have any comments. I think there is some question about carbon rights. What is that? There were questions about other issues and comments. But I think at this point, what I would like to do is I would like to bring back all our speakers to have their last words. Carmen, do you have anything to add? And then I would then ask Donna to come in later on. Anything that you wanted to add or provide additional comments or input, please?
Just to comment that, as I mentioned in my PowerPoint, that we are still in the process of working through on the global level, a grievance mechanism, participation in a supervisory body on these issues that involve these market mechanisms. And many years ago, maybe almost 20 years ago, I asked one of the indigenous economists, one of the few indigenous economists that I know, about carbon market and what was her view as an economist on this. And she told me that she didn't know very much about climate change issues, but as an economist, she would say that anytime you put a price on something, the incentive is to make more of it, not less. And so that you have something to trade. So she didn't see how carbon markets or pricing carbon would actually be an incentive to reduce carbon emissions. And I just want to throw that out there. We are still debating these issues, and the main concern, I think, is the displacement of indigenous peoples for forests that will be used as carbon sinks. Same with 30 by 30 protected areas, that in many cases it ends up displacing the indigenous peoples that have preserved these areas, so that there are forests that can absorb carbon. So there is biodiversity that is still active and vital. So these are still issues that are being debated, and safeguards. We are working to put those in place globally, that then of course would have to be translated to the national level. But there are a lot of concerns by indigenous peoples relating to rights and rights violations currently being carried out in the implementation of the carbon market, which is why I said we're, working on those safeguards and grievance mechanisms and full participation in these discussions on the global level. So I just wanted to say that. Thank you.
Excellent, Andrea. Thank you so much for the additional and very valuable inputs. Donna, please.
Thank you, Morris. Thank you, everyone. And thank you to the speakers. I also learned so much in this session. So I'm really happy to be part of this discussion. I leave you with four points. We really would like to encourage our indigenous peoples and local communities to engage while the UNFCCC is a party-driven process and it stays at the international level, there are a lot of opportunities. Go engage through your party delegations, submit through the submission portals, connect with your regional representatives. There are opportunities, and we really, the convention and the Paris Agreement has laid down the opportunities so we can all contribute and be part of the collective and help in the collectively contribute to reach the goals of the Paris Agreement and the convention. We really hope that you can take the leadership role, help us really take the lead in the transformative climate action. This is the transformative year, transformative COP will be in Dubai. And just like what Jennifer said, document and really help us in changing the mindset of parties and the delegations towards transformative climate actions that are anchored on indigenous values and worldviews. This is opportunity. You have the GST and the GGA, and they are really waiting and really asking for your contributions. And last but not least, please make use of the platform. We really want to we hope that you can help us reach the many local communities and indigenous peoples and really hear from them. My dears, the power of the many will really transform the process. It's slow. There are a lot of heartaches and challenges, but it will work. We need to work together at the national, regional, and global levels. And I think nothing will be impossible if we'll do this together. Thank you so much again, and hope to see you all in Bonn, and if not in Bonn, in the future activities of the LCIPP. Thank you.
Excellent, Donna. Thank you very much for those reminders. Very important. And we are going to have the last words for Lakpa, please.
Thanks, Morris, and thanks, everyone. I would just like to emphasize 2 points as remarks, because I think for me personally, the inspiration that comes from is really on the ground, and I think that's why it's so much important, and that I really value about community mobilization and empowerment, because in the context of Asia, like everyone said, the indigenous peoples, government do not recognize as indigenous peoples. So there is a political uncertainty in terms of who comes into the government and leads the policy change and things like that. And I think that doesn't change. It's really the strength of the people, strength of the community. And I think there is a greater amount of time, energy, and resources needed to really empower the communities in the ground. And I think if we can make the community stronger at the local level, I think things will slowly start to change even at the higher level. And also it's the other way around, also to tap into the international opportunity to make the changes at the national level. And I would also like to add one more point, because the spirit that came out from the Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework is everybody has a role to play. Government cannot work alone. Indigenous peoples cannot work alone. Civil society cannot work alone. If youth, women, everybody, if we work separately, we're going nowhere, basically. We're just having different contributions and role at different places. So it's really a time for us to come together, put our effort together. And like what Jennifer said, collective actions is really a key actually towards transformative change and that we want to see at different levels. So I think there is a power towards the collective work that we all need to do. And I'm sure there is other opportunity that we need to continue having discussion like this. So I'll just say partnership is really key towards the future direction of our work.
Thank you, Lakpa. Such a powerful words of wisdom, as always. Thank you so much. Jen, please.
I'm conscious that we're running out of time. The only thing I would like to say at this as last words is that we worked so hard at the global level as indigenous peoples, and we have had such big achievements. And nothing is a complete victory. There are always risks, and there are always opportunities associated with some of the global policy mechanisms and the policies that we've managed to put in place at the global level. So we need to take these and use them as tools so that they are used in a way that benefits us as Indigenous peoples on the ground. A tool, it depends on the way you use it. It's neither good nor bad. And I think we need to harness our power as Indigenous peoples. And as Lakpa said, change the narrative so that we make use of these tools in the most effective way and in the most transformative way possible. Thanks.
Wonderful. Colleagues, join me in applauding, thanking all our experts. Once again, Jennifer Corpus from Tero, Andrea Carmen from IITC, the International Indian Treaty Council, Lakpa Sherpa from AIPP, the Asia Indigenous Peoples Park Foundation, and of course, Donna, our colleague from UN CCC and LCIPP. We are very grateful for all of you. The UN Voluntary Fund is a partnership, and this training is part of that partnership. And what we've been trying to do is to provide a series of capacity building with Indigenous peoples and for Indigenous peoples. This is the third series now. Someone is asking, how can you continue having this, accessing this training? Don't worry, we have 7 more to come. How we have structured is we structured our online training prior to a very specific UN meeting or process that Indigenous peoples participate. And precisely, this is a part of what Lakpa had mentioned, so that then you as Indigenous representative can effectively participate and fully engage in the process, whether this is at local, national, and international level. And the way we always do is we always bring our colleagues who are insiders from those UN processes and mechanisms to explain to us the in and out of those mechanisms. But then at the same time, because these people, they don't use the mechanism themselves, they provide support and services. And that is why it's important to have those people who are coming from Indigenous organizations or civil society to have that complementary aspect of how Indigenous peoples access, used those mechanisms, those who have lived experience in using those mechanisms. And that is why it's important to have Andrea Carmen, Lakpa Sherpa, and Jennifer Corpus on these processes. Colleagues, you have seen that, from the good practices, lessons learned that Jennifer has mentioned, the importance of effective participation in general, whether this is at a local, national, and international level, ensuring that those who are most vulnerable, that we don't leave no one behind, that we anchored our work, our advocacy work on the UN Declaration, because this is the international standards that we have, but not to also forget that the Declaration is a minimum standards. So make sure that we use all the tools, Jennifer has mentioned these, all the tools possibly, whether this is CEDAW on women, CRC and the rights of the child, and the ILO Convention 169, for example, or the UN CCC, many standards that Donna has mentioned. So colleagues, thank you once again. We look forward. Our next session is on the expert mechanism and the rights of Indigenous peoples. It's coming very soon. So those of you who are planning to come to Geneva, the expert mechanism is from the 17th. I don't want to come in the middle of the session. It's from the 17th to the 21st of July in Geneva. And those of you who are planning to come, I think the registration is still open, but please do come in Bonn. It's the first one that is upcoming. It's next week, very soon. So we'll see you sooner in Bonn or otherwise in other parts of the world. Once again, thank you very much. And on behalf of our colleagues in the organizing team and our partners, just to mention again, AIPP provided the interpretation. Thank you very much. And Cultural Survivor has been the home of this training. So once again, colleague, maraming salamat po. We'll see you soon again. Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.